based on selfish ideas was not the way to end suffering. I could tell that very quickly. So I left the United States. I volunteered for the American Peace Corps in 1963, just before President Kennedy was assassinated. So I was actually in the Peace Corps training in Hawaii when he was assassinated, and that was, of course, a big shock. And I was sent off to Sabah in Malaysia. And of course, this brought me into the Theravada world, in the fact that I was in Southeast Asia, where I'd never been before. And of course, Thailand was not far away. It was an easy place to go to on holidays. So I went, first holiday I had, I went off to Thailand and Cambodia. Now, when I finished my contract, then I returned to Thailand and started practicing meditation at one of the main temples in Bangkok. And from there, I began to see the value of meditation, which led me to an interest in ordination. Now, before the Buddha passed away, it's questioned, what will we do without our teacher? And he says, I leave you the Dhamma Vinaya. And so this is quite an enigmatic statement. Why didn't he just say, I leave you the Dhamma? Because in the West, most people are interested in Dhamma. They love the Dhamma. And the Vinaya is not so popular. And so, and oftentimes easily seen in terms of moralistic boundaries and restrictions on behavior that modern day people do not respect or like or think necessary in their lives. But I found in the training I received with Luang Por Chah in his monastery in northeast Thailand, in Newborn, I began to really value the fact of learning to live within a restrained way, rather than just interpreting things in my own way, and this sense of I can do it myself attitude that I had. And of course, Ajahn Chah is very famous for his strict Vinaya, because in Thailand there are, so many 200,000 monks and monasteries everywhere, ranging from the very best to probably the worst. They've got an enormous amount of Buddhist monks living in Thailand, and of course and part of Thai Buddhism can be just seen as ceremonial or academic. Luang Por Chah was very much emphasizing bhatipata, or meditation practice, combined with the Vinaya. And this I found a practice most beneficial. Before, I just used a method of meditation, somebody's method, that was only applicable really to a kind of formal sitting practice. But in Luang Por Chah's approach, his whole way of developing vipassana was through living the monastic life, using Vinaya as a reference for and as a guide for behavior, physical behavior and speech, to be mindful. And so the emphasis was on mindfulness, awareness, knowing yourself, knowing what you're feeling, knowing the causes of suffering, the attachment to views, opinions, and desires that arise in our minds, investigating this according to the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. So this was the basic teaching Luang Por Chah emphasized, and when he taught, he always was mentioning these Four Noble Truths, and to learn how to investigate them and develop the insights so that one can find out for oneself. It's no longer just, what the Buddha taught in India 2,552 years ago, but you can actually find out for yourself. And of course, this attitude of finding out for yourself is very much what attracts Western people, or in countries such as European countries or North America, Australia, New Zealand, countries where Buddhism really had there was not much interest, knowledge, or understanding of it before. And in the past 50 years, of course, there's been an enormous increase in an interest in the teaching of the Buddha. And I've been involved in that for over 50 years, actually. I've been in about 1955, 56, I became interested in Buddhism. So I've seen from a rather, when it first started on the West Coast in the San Francisco Bay Area, it was more like a fashion, like Zen Buddhist way of thinking, paradoxes and enigmatic statements were kind of fashionable to fling about or think about at that time among the intelligentsia of the Bay Area. And so it could be seen as something very superficial and just a kind of silly fashion of the age. But it actually affected many of us in a profound way. As you can see, I'm sitting here now and spending most of my life as a Buddhist monk, because it first started with the kind of interpretations of Japanese Zen Buddhism that were available in English in 1955. Now, Luang Por Chah, I found, was when I went to Thailand, my main interest had been through the Japanese Zen literature. I'd never practiced it. I'd never found a teacher in the Bay Area. I looked during those years I lived in Berkeley. I went everywhere where there was a possibility of finding some meditation teacher, but couldn't find any. And so this, of course, made it very clear I had to go to Asia to find one. I thought of going to Japan and taking up Zen Buddhism, but when I was assigned to Sabah, and then I was in a nice warm place, in fact quite hot, and then going to Thailand, nice warm country, and I remember those cold winters in Japan in the Navy, and I heard that the Japanese monks did not heat their monasteries. So people wonder, they say, why did you leave Zen Buddhism and join Theravada? What did you find so, why did you choose Theravada over Zen? And there's nothing doctrinal, it's just the weather. And then Thailand, of course, offers an opportunity to live in a country that's, you could say, is 95% Buddhist. And there are not many countries left like that, where they have, most of the population regard themselves as Theravadan Buddhists. And of course, the king Bhumibol Adulyadej, he's a Buddhist, and the whole structure and the cultural values of Thailand are based on, very strongly intertwined with Buddhism. Now, living with somebody like Luang Por Chah for 10 years, I thought was indeed an honor, because I'd never really met anybody that affected me so strongly as he did. And when I met him, I was not particularly looking for a teacher. I didn't have any great need at that time, or I didn't feel any great interest in. I'd been to so many teachers already. I was more or less looking for a place to train as a bhikkhu. I thought I wanted to, if I was a bhikkhu, I wanted to be a good one. And I needed the discipline. I needed to learn how to obey a teacher, how to surrender myself to discipline that I had no ability to manipulate or change in any way. I saw that during my life, I had lived very much manipulating conditions for my own benefit, and the result was not a positive one. It was not the way out of suffering. In fact, by the age of 30, I was quite a miserable character. And so, learning to submit, to surrender to a form, to a tradition, was quite a new thing to be doing for me. Even though it's an ancient tradition, I'd never, Americans, we don't have ancient traditions in that country. It's all about progress and modernization and making things better. So learning to live within a very conservative type of Thai Buddhism in northeast Thailand and Vinaya discipline, but also it wasn't just a kind of military training camp atmosphere. It was based on mindfulness, reflection, and observing. Now, it was a unique situation for me because I was the first Westerner to go there, to be with Ajahn Chah. And I couldn't speak the Thai language, and nobody there could speak English. And then the cultural attitude was very different, from my own American values. And so it was, it brought up a lot of all kinds of emotions, negative emotions. At first I was very inspired. I had the inspiration. But then actually through living there and having to learn another language and conform to a system after you'd been so, emphasized you were nonconformist and you were asserting yourself as an independent creature, and then finding yourself in absolute conformity to an ancient tradition. This brought up all kinds of doubts and negative reactions in my mind. Now, Luang Por Chah was very good at getting me to look at my mental states. Even before we had a common language to discuss Dhamma with, he somehow had this intuitive sense. He could pick up on the kind of emotional quality that one had in the moment. And then his direction was always encouraging one to look at it, to see it, to observe it. And so they have this sense of being the knower of the condition, not the condition. So even when learning the Thai language, there were certain phrases that I'd pick up because you'd hear them quite often. And these phrases, just simple reflections Luang Por Chah kept using in his talks, in his Dhamma talks. And they were just like don't be the owner of your feelings, be the witness to them. So this attitude, they used the mantra a lot of Bhutto, the kind of Buddha's name, as a way of reminding yourself to be the awareness itself and observe the condition you're actually feeling in the moment. And I found this so something I could actually do because of my frustration, my reactions to discipline, and the kind of paranoia that can generate in somebody's mind when they don't quite understand what's going on most of the time. So the way they'd laugh, or there'd be a joke or laughter, and I wouldn't know what they were laughing at, and then they'd look at me, and I could interpret that as they're laughing at me, as being some kind of humiliation, or I could look at that feeling, the way I would on my personal way of interpreting experience. I began to observe it in the sense of being the knower rather than the condition. Began to take its effect so that my life in the monastery, within a couple of years, I'd become really I thought myself very much of a Thai monk. And when the Western men started coming there, I didn't really want them, actually. Because I'd learned how to be a Thai monk, and they hadn't, and then I was the only one that I had to translate for them. And of course, all the kind of wild attitudes and that was the hippie era, and the kind of characters that would arrive at the monastery in Ubon. I found, it was like distressing to me, because I had kind of developed my practice through this kind of surrendering to, in that way, and learning to find a measure of peace, tranquility, through not having a lot of conflict with others. And then, of course, the ones that bring up most of one's strong emotions, I found, were other Americans. They could arouse extreme emotions more than any Thai could do. And so eventually I ran away after my 6th year, because I couldn't face having to be with all these Western monks, and me being the senior one. So I deliberately left and eventually went to India, and there I spent 6 months walking as a Tudong monk in India. I thought I wanted to see if I could actually live like Gautama the Buddha. And so, during that time, I kept thinking back of all the generosity I'd received in Thailand and of Luang Por Chah. And it was in India that I had this strong opening of the heart. It was what I call Gatanyu Gataveti, or gratitude. It wasn't just a kind of intellectual thanks for the meditation lessons kind of thing. It was a really gut feeling of realizing how much had been given to me, support from the lay people, encouragement from the lay people, the bhikkhus that I lived with, and of course Luang Por Chah as a teacher. Well, that what I call the Gatanyu as a kind of heart opening. I call it, for me, it was a heart-opening experience. Before that, so much of my monastic life was still operating from the very self-centered ego, where I want to get my practice, get my jhanas, get my samadhi, get enlightened. There's so much of me as a person trying to get things. And operate, within the system in order to, from this very willful, self-centered position. And this experience of Gatanyu that I had in India was, I saw through that. The heart opened up wide. Before, I'd say I had a closed-off heart, like a tight fist. Just tight, and and I'm the most. I'm in this to get enlightened for myself. And then after the Gatanyu experience and insight, it was like the sense of something had really shifted. That tight, self-centered selfishness seemed to have resolved itself. And all I could think of then was going back to Thailand and helping, supporting in any way, being a good disciple to Luang Por Chah. I thought the only way you can repay a teacher that's given you so much is to be a good disciple, practice what he was teaching. I knew that would make him very pleased, and not to be a pain to him, not to give him any problems. So at that time Ajahn Chah was expanding. The monasteries were growing everywhere, and there were all kinds of people seeking ordination, and the amount of disciples increased. And there were always problems in any monastery. There are always going to be problems. And so I thought, well, I'm going to make an effort not to be a problem to Luang Por Chah. So when I went back to India, from India to Thailand, I offered myself a kind of magnanimous gesture. I offer myself to you. And of course, he just smiled, and then eventually he sent me off to establish Wat Pa Nana Chat, which is exactly the thing I most didn't want to do. Now, even though Ajahn Chah was good at getting me to do things I didn't want to do, I did have confidence and trust in him, in his wisdom, after living with him for many years. That I didn't really question it. My vow was to help in any way I could, and to do what I could, what Luang Por Chah wanted me to do, and to be a good disciple to him, and practice what I'd learned with the teaching he'd given me. So this led eventually to 2 years I was at Nana Chat, and then the Southeast Asia fell to the communists, the panic in Thailand, and eventually I began to think about going back to the West, which strangely enough I ended up in England rather than the United States. Now this, in teaching in England for 33 years now, where, say, you have, like our monasteries in England, we have two main monasteries, Amaravati, which is in Hertfordshire, north of London, and the first monastery that we had, it was south of London in West Sussex, Cittaviveka. And so there was a great interest in Buddhist meditation, in samatha vipassana practices amongst the British and Europeans. In general, there was, we began to grow very rapidly. And of course, seeing, the results of living in England, which is the country I know the best, living there for 33 years, and teaching meditation and establishing monasteries, ordaining monks, nuns there, and to train them with the Vinaya, and to develop the values of samana, sanya. So like the monastic tradition that the Buddha established is based on alms mendicancy. And this, of course, is totally anachronistic to Western European culture. And so to make yourself, without, any support, to depend on the four requisites, and that was something that was just not in the minds of people in the West, either in North America or in Europe at the time. And it's still difficult for people to really appreciate because it's something so out of place in the value systems of modern life in Europe or America at this time. And yet, living in England for this long period, there's never been any shortage of the requisites. Like the 4 requisites the Buddha allowed samanas. He allowed us a robe. We can wear a robe which is based on a very low standard of material, rag robes. So the Buddha said you can get your cloth from what's left over, what the society throws out, or we go to charnel grounds where they wrap corpses in cloth, and you could take that. You could take the kind of rags that the lay communities didn't want. And so that's about as low a standard for clothing as you can imagine. And of course this is, and this wasn't a rule based, this isn't a rule that you can only do that. But what happened was that the lay people began to have such faith in the followers of the Buddha that they offered to present good quality material to them. And that's what the katina ceremonies are. Every year after the Vasa we have the katina, this traditional ceremony of offering cloth to the monastic sangha. And of course, because I've never had to go off and take rags off a corpse or anything like that. In fact, they usually give me high quality cloth. And we have to sew it and make it look like rags, patches. And dye it an ugly color like this. But then food is a necessity. You have something to wear, something to eat. So he allowed us to have an alms bowl. As you saw us all eating from alms bowls. And of course this means that we go out and collect food. As bindabata means dropping food into a bowl. So this is a custom, of an alms mendicant, and it's based on a low standard. We're not gourmets, or so we want only your best food. We take what is offered, So you're going on bindabata, and people, whether they're poor or wealthy, or they're good cooks or not very good cooks, or whether they're vegetarian or meat-eating people, we take what is offered, and this is, the practice of alms food. So we're dependent on this, the lay community offering food, and then shelter would be very difficult in England. It's based on root of a tree. I can't imagine, living very long under a root of a tree in England without dying. In India you can actually see that, and you have these magnificent trees there, but how, or here in Malaya it probably is possible, but not in England. It would be really hard work to have to stay under a tree. But notice that the standard is always the lowest possible one, because then something's always offered that's better than this low reference point. And then for medicine, for illness, we have to have medicine, and this is based on a very low standard of that time, fermented cow's urine. So this shocks the British, so they really come forth when we get sick, see that we get good medical help. And so these 4 requisites are reflected on every day in monasteries, the four requisites, because you're training yourself as a samana to see that this is the 4 requisites are adequate for the day. They're not guaranteed for a lifetime or anything. So it's just today I have a shelter, food. I receive food in the alms bowl. I have a robe and medicine for any sickness that I have. And then arises the gatanyu, gratitude, because we live our lives always in this way of depending on the good-heartedness and generosity of others. And of course, the lay people, whether they're here in Malaya or in Thailand or in England, they're always giving us, they find joy in offering. And even monks who have gone tudong or walking in England, Scotland, and Ireland have gone, Vindabhata or receiving food in villages where there aren't any Buddhists, and yet you still receive food. People come forth once they understand what you need. It seems to bring up a very good quality of mind in the lay community, even if they're not Buddhists or they don't really understand what you are. It seems to generate goodness in itself. And of course, this alms mendicant tradition has survived 2,552 years, which says a lot for the wisdom of the Buddha, because there's not many traditions that have such a long lineage that I know of, that are still existent at this time. Now, this tradition also has maintained its purity. It's not been corrupted or adapted all out of proportion. It seems to be able to adapt itself to the rise and falls of many different political systems and periods of development and progress, and then of degeneration and loss. You look at the history of Buddhism over that period of time, and it is about, it's at period of times it flourishes, and other times it seems to fade away. But it still survives. And up to this very today, here in Kuala Lumpur, this very moment, this is the monks, the bhikkhus, the nuns here, representing that tradition and that lineage that traces itself back to the original Buddha in India, that established the Dhamma teaching and the Vinaya. So this is my reflection on the value of that tradition, and seeing it as something to really respect, and then this sense of gratitude arises. You feel, I have an enormous sense of gratitude to the Buddha, the Gautama the Buddha, the one who established this teaching and the Vinaya. So when I think of the Buddha, I do feel in this gratitude, a sense of piti, as they say, or rapture, a really good feeling, that comes not through, it's not about being happy because I get something, it's just a sense of a lovely sense of gratitude and joy at having been one who has this opportunity to live this way at this time, because, say, living as a Buddhist alms mendicant in England was never part of my social and cultural expectation. It was the most kind of impossible thing to think about. I never once thought I'd be living as an alms mendicant in England for so long. And yet, this is what's happened. And this is where the kind of practice of the Dhamma and the life kind of, you have to flow with it. You just can't try to arrange it and according to on your own terms. It's a matter of relinquishing, letting go, trusting. Before I went to England, I began to get a lot of anxiety about going to live in England, for example, because Thailand's very easy, to be a bhikkhu, and the culture and the people and everything. You can take everything for granted there. It's very easy. wherever you go in Thailand, people know what to do, and so that's where and in India I could survive because they still respect the sadhu or the religious mendicant. It's still possible to live as an alms mendicant in India. But in England, I didn't know, having ever lived there. And what would happen, if I can't have money, how am I going to get on in life, living in a very materialistic country that don't, may not have any interest or even may feel very hostile to somebody in a robe like this. And so I went to Ajahn Chah before the time came to go to England, and I asked him, I said, I really wonder if I could actually survive for very long in England as an alms mendicant, keeping the vinaya like we do here. I just have grave doubts about it. And so Luang Por Chah said something to me that really impressed me. He said, you mean there are no kind people in England? And so I thought, well, I'm sure there are. And then he said, well, then go there. And he didn't say Buddhists either. He said kind people. That struck me because I had a much more cynical attitude about the nature of humanity. My attitude is that basically we're selfish. And that's what, our true nature is selfish. Luang Por Chah's attitude is that we're basically good. And since he was a wise person, that kind of changed my, I thought, that's a better way of looking at humanity than the way I looked at it. It's basically selfish. And so then going to live in England, I remember that people basically good. And that's what I've found in the reality of living as a bhikkhu, as a Buddhist monk in the UK and in Europe in general. Well, that is something to contemplate, and then this sense of gratitude arises, and a faith, confidence in practice of Dhamma, and in the wisdom that the Buddha, the original Buddha, Gautama the Buddha, in which he could, so well establish a conventional form that could last this long. That takes wisdom to be able to see how to establish something, a religious convention and a teaching that is incorruptible, like the Four Noble Truths. That's never been corrupted by anybody in 2,552 years. It's just the same noble truth that he gave his 5 friends in Saranath 2,500 years ago. And then the monastic order has survived through this period of time. Up to the present time now, it appears in countries like United States, Canada, in European countries. Not only Western Europe, but European Union now. Western Europe is no longer politically correct. European Union, and in countries all over the world. I've been invited to Russia several times and given meditation retreats in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and been invited so many places that I can't possibly meet all the invitations because I haven't learned how to appear in 2 places at the same moment. That I can't do. But within the limitations that I find myself, I try to meet the needs and the interest that is generated all over the world. And then with the media at this time, the mass media, there's no longer a dearth of information, and scriptural information or commentarial information on various forms of Buddhism. In the UK, almost every possible form of traditional Buddhism, of Mahayana, Theravada, Tibetan Buddhism, as well as all kinds of modern forms of Buddhism. Different organizations design their own Buddhism in their own way. So there's all kinds of modern adaptations to Buddhism in the UK, as well as traditional forms. So this was not existent 50 years ago. This was not possible, say 50 years ago in either the UK or the United States. So it's very heartwarming to see the amount of interest here in Malaysia, because I didn't see anything of this when I lived here 45 years ago in Sabah. It wasn't, I didn't have any inkling that anything like this meeting would have an Ajahn Chah celebration day in Kuala Lumpur. I would never have conceived that as being possible. And so now where we go with the amount of interest here in Penang and various other places in Malaysia, among people who see the value and the wisdom behind it, and who have a willingness to listen, to study, to practice. This I want to encourage and assure you this is a very good direction to take, both for personal ways of solving problems and difficulties within your own life, as well as generating good qualities in the society that we're living in. Because here in Malaysia we want to be good citizens and not cause divisions and problems, to be divisive within this society, but to be a force for harmony and goodness, generosity within this lovely country of Malaysia. So I'll leave this with you as a reflection for your consideration, and I'd express my gratitude to all of those who have so well organized this event, and feel very honored to be invited to participate. Thank you.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So I'd like to ask permission from the Venerable Mahatheras and the Sangha. Express my greetings to all the lay people here today. One of Ajahn Chah's constant reminders was that the most valuable thing we can do is, with our whole lives in fact, is to make our minds peaceful. So we've all come from different places perhaps and had some activity in the last hour or so perhaps we can just start by sitting quietly, compose our minds to hear Dhamma, to reflect on Dhamma, and prepare to bring that Dhamma into our lives. Just for a few minutes, a very short time, just to establish ourselves here, just some quiet breathing. So today is a day of remembering an individual person, but perhaps more importantly, a life well lived and teachings given and a practice undertaken and taken to its fullness, its fruition. The important thing for all of us, students of the Dhamma from whatever tradition, lay or monastic, is of course to reflect on how we can bring these teachings, the life of an individual, into our own lives in a way where it becomes a modern day reality. This morning we heard from somebody who was fortunate, Ajahn Sumedho, very lucky to have spent many years living with Ajahn Chah, and this evening there will be other speakers who lived with him directly. I've been asked to speak today as a monk ordained in the tradition, out of faith in Buddha Dhamma, but also having contacted Ajahn Chah to a certain degree. But I can't say that he was my direct teacher in the same way. I never got the chance to sit at his feet and hear the stories, hear the jokes, or get the hard teachings, be admonished. When he was fierce, he was very fierce. When he was warm, he was very warm. So I never got that directly. But I was fortunate enough to pay my respects to him while he was still alive. But by that time he was already very sick. He had had a serious medical condition for many years, was unable to speak, was virtually paralyzed. Yet, that meeting with him and that chance to be around him just for a short time, but more importantly to come into close contact with the tradition that was already growing up around him and was being slowly established and was already thriving actually, was enough to feel this was an individual who I could really give my life to. And in fact, there was no other thing that seemed logical to do. So perhaps as a Dhamma sharing today, just to share some of that with everybody. In May of 1989, I had taken a temporary Samanera ordination in Thailand, partly as an interesting experience. I was 18 years old, partly as an offering to my family, my Thai family, but not really knowing anything about Buddhism, Buddhist practice, meditation, or the tradition. At the time I could not speak Thai, and so by good fortune, my upajjhaya, my preceptor, sent me to Wat Bananachat, which Ajahn Sumedho spoke about this morning, the monastery for Westerners, where the language of instruction given was in English. And so that was the real first encounter, you could say, with Ajahn Chah, simply arriving in a monastery of his tradition. One already felt his presence. And in many ways it wasn't easy. It wasn't a welcome presence, because simply put, it was physically very demanding. rising very early, 3 a.m., long bindabata, morning chanting, meditation, difficult conditions, and monks practicing seemed very strictly, very little talking going on. And myself not knowing anything about the tradition, unable to meditate, lonely, and wondering what it was really all about. It all seemed very austere. And some of the chants we would do in morning and evening chanting also I found very jarring. On the boards outside in the exhibition, you see the words Jara Damomi Jaranganatito. So we used to chant this Jara Damomi Jaranganatito. I am of the nature to age. I have not gone beyond aging. It seemed very somber, negative and depressing. Bayadi Damomi Bayadinganatito. I am of the nature to sicken. I have not gone beyond sickness. Marana Damomi Marananganatito. I am of the nature to die. I have not gone beyond death. I couldn't really understand why we needed to start the day in this particular way. Surely there could be something a bit more uplifting. And then we would move on to contemplating the body. And we chant these 32 parts, many of you familiar with, going through hair of the head, hair of the nails, teeth, skin, and then internal organs as well, heart, lungs, onto intestines, and the other more unattractive and usually less desirable parts of the body. And again, I couldn't quite understand why we were focusing on the fact that, as the chant goes, this body is a sealed bag of skin filled with unattractive things. I thought, this Ajahn Chah must be very strange to teach his disciples to chant this. I didn't realize that actually these words went back to the original Buddha. I had such little understanding. So I was learning day by day, and it wasn't easy. And I wasn't really sure if I would be able to hang in there for more than a week or two. But one thing there was to look forward to would be, I was told we would go and pay respects to Ajahn Chah, the great master himself, in a few days' time. It was the tradition that on the lunar observance day, the Sangha would all get into pickup trucks and drive over a few kilometers to Wat Nong Papong, his monastery, and pay respects to Ajahn Chah. And I was told then I would get a chance to finally see Ajahn Chah, and I was very happy about that. So I'd heard so much about him, seen so many lovely pictures. He seemed this being full of smiling metta and the wisdom. Everybody seemed so inspired. I thought this will really help me. But that meeting was, again, very, very difficult. It was almost disturbing. We would drive to the monastery and then park and then go to his kuti, the hut where he was being looked after. I'd been told that he doesn't teach very much anymore because he's sick. But I wasn't expecting the sight of Ajahn Chah, very frail, looking tiny compared to this larger-than-life figure in the pictures, without his false teeth, his whole face sunken in, and being wheeled out by two attendant monks, both wearing masks covering their mouth for hygiene. It just seemed like a very grim picture. What a traumatic scene. So again, those of you that have seen the exhibition or afterwards, there are pictures of that period of his life, in a wheelchair, paralyzed, unable to speak, even with a bandage, a plaster over his throat, covering the tracheotomy tube where he was fed. So this is a very powerful image. I'd been brought up in London, and in the West, as many of you know, suffering of that kind, old age, sickness, is not really brought out into the public sphere. And certainly young people don't make a special effort to go and pay respects to people who are old and sick, and make that a big part of their week, and sit contemplating somebody who's old and sick. And we did the chanting, and then there was a period of silent meditation, and the attendant monks were fanning away the mosquitoes. And then we paid respects, bowed, and they wheeled Ajahn Chah back into his hospital kuti. And there was this sense of deep, deep disappointment. Because the thought arose in me, well, I won't be able to learn anything from the master if he's in this state. And then another thought, another nagging doubt about Buddhism arose, because I'd been learning about the law of karma, that good actions bring good results, and I thought, well, if this is the enlightened master who surely did so much good action in his life, if this is what it comes to, then what chance is there for someone like me? So I was thinking about this Buddhism. It didn't seem to offer much of a solution. So as we were putting our robes on and getting back into the pickup trucks, I commented to one of the monks. I said, "Oh, isn't it a pity that Ajahn Chah has to suffer so much?" And he knew I was new to this Dhamma, so he sort of smiled and said to me, "Why do you think he's suffering?" And then it was time to get in the pickup trucks. But that answer was very, very powerful. Actually, with hindsight, it's very powerful, because it wasn't a refutation. It wasn't necessarily saying, no, he's not suffering, he's enlightened. He was simply asking me to reflect on my own bias, my own preconception, that somebody physically sick, aging, unable to move, unable to speak, with a hole in their throat to be fed, with needing monks attending you 24 hours a day, that person would necessarily be suffering. That was my assumption, and that the Dhamma hadn't seemed to work for them. So luckily there was something in me that said, yes, why do I assume that he's suffering? That night was the observance night, and as is the practice in Ajahn Chah monasteries, we sat up all night, or tried to. Very difficult thing to do, meditate all night. Most people don't quite make it. And in the morning, 3:30, we began the chanting again. Jara dhammo mi jarang anatito. I am of the nature to age. I have not gone beyond aging. Bayati dhammo mi bayating anatito. I am of the nature to sicken. I have not gone beyond sickness. Marana dhammo mi maranang anatito. I am of the nature to die. I have not gone beyond dying. Sabbe piyehi, and you know the rest. All that is mine, beloved and pleasing, will become otherwise, will become separated from me. And suddenly there was the feeling, the deep realization, that rather than being a negative statement or a negative way of looking at things, that finally here was truth. This was the undeniable truth. And Luang Por Chah, in his state, which I'd taken to be so miserable, so negative, was a living testament to that truth. And I realized something that struck me late in that evening was that no one else seemed to mind Luang Por Chah being in that state. All his disciples, the lay people, the monks, it wasn't as if there was a problem. I'm sure obviously they wouldn't have chosen their teacher to become sick, but because all his life he'd been preparing them for that, preparing for that nature. Dhamma, entire Dhamma chart means nature, the birth of Dhamma. So the natural process to take place, when it finally happened to him, it was simply the next phase of his teaching, absolutely in line with the way he had been living his life and the way he'd been teaching. So luckily, as is so often the case in our lives, we have a moment, you could call it a little moment of insight, or a shift takes place. And suddenly I became very keen to really study this truth. And thinking back at my life as a layperson, as a teenager, back in England, and then coming to Malaysia and Thailand on my family holidays, seeking pleasure, enjoying things, very nice, nothing too blameworthy about that, but realizing that essentially there was a deception going on. There was the constant message was, of course, that the external world, the material world, the sensual world is where we will find our happiness. And when the material world, the sensual world